Do you know that in some parts of the United States, innocent black people are 7 times more likely to be convicted of murder than innocent white people? Not only that, but in the same American states where black people were lynched are today the places where black defendants are given death sentences by the criminal justice system. Since 1973, about 53% of the wrong death sentences have been given to black people, showing how racist these states are to this day. But things don't stop here. There is a massive wealth gap between black and white people that leads to worse social disparities in some American states. For every $100 possessed by white people, black people have only $33. So what are these states where black people face the most challenges in income, housing, and social services? In this video, let's find out. Number 10. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, which is celebrated for its historic landmarks and cultural significance, hides deep racial disparities that disproportionately affect its black residents. Across cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, systemic barriers in housing, education, and economic stability perpetuate cycles of inequality, limiting opportunities for advancement. In Pittsburgh, predominantly black neighborhoods like the Hill District and Homewood are marked by underfunded schools, food deserts, and aging infrastructure. Public transportation in these areas is unreliable, creating significant challenges for residents seeking employment outside their neighborhoods. Similarly, in North and West Philadelphia, poverty rates among black residents exceed 30%, well above the state average. This disinvestment leaves many families in substandard living conditions with limited access to essential services, further rooting economic disparities. These challenges extend to education, where black children in Pennsylvania are more likely to attend underfunded and overcrowded schools. Schools in predominantly black areas often spend 25% less per student than wealthier, predominantly white districts. This disparity results in lower graduation rates and fewer college opportunities, perpetuating economic inequality and limiting the potential for upward mobility across generations. Pennsylvania's history of systemic racism exacerbates these issues. Although the state abolished slavery early, practices like redlining, segregation, and exclusionary lending policies persisted well into the 20th century. Black families were systematically excluded from suburban developments and relegated to urban areas with fewer resources. These historical injustices laid the foundation for the racial wealth gap that continues to disadvantage black communities today. Number 9. Kansas. Kansas, often associated with its open plains and welcoming reputation, conceals significant economic disparities that hinder its black residents. Systemic barriers, particularly in housing, education, and entrepreneurship, limit opportunities for wealth building and stability. For many black families in Kansas, homeownership remains an unattainable goal. With just 32% of black residents owning homes compared to 72% of white residents, the gap shows decades of discriminatory practices. Predominantly black neighborhoods in cities like Wichita and Kansas City experience lower property values, 40% lower than those in predominantly white areas, and often lack essential amenities like grocery stores, parks, and healthcare facilities. This absence of resources further diminishes living standards and wealth-building opportunities. Economic challenges extend beyond housing. Black-owned businesses account for less than 2% of all businesses in the state, highlighting the difficulty in accessing capital and resources. Many black workers are employed in low-wage industries such as retail and food services, with average annual earnings of just $25,000. This lack of economic opportunity widens the racial wealth gap, making it difficult for black families to achieve financial stability or build generational wealth. Education remains another significant hurdle. Schools with predominantly black students receive 20 to 25% less funding per student than predominantly white schools, leading to lower test scores, graduation rates, and college admissions. This systemic underfunding perpetuates economic disparities, restricting opportunities for Black students to secure higher-paying jobs and break the cycle of poverty. Although Kansas is celebrated for its abolitionist history, systemic racism persisted through the 20th century. Black residents were frequently denied access to federally backed loans and excluded from desirable neighborhoods, leaving a legacy of entrenched inequality that still shapes the economic landscape today. Number 8. Michigan. Michigan's industrial decline has left Black residents struggling with significant economic and social challenges, particularly in cities like Detroit and Flint. In Detroit, the collapse of the automotive industry devastated predominantly Black neighborhoods, leading to unemployment rates as high as 15% in some areas. These neighborhoods, now characterized by abandoned homes, crumbling infrastructure, and failing public services, offer limited opportunities for stable employment or upward mobility. The economic void left by deindustrialization has created a cycle of poverty that persists across generations. The health crises in Michigan further show systemic neglect. Flint's population, which is 57% Black, continues to suffer from the consequences of lead-contaminated water, including developmental disorders and chronic health issues. Detroit has some of the highest asthma rates in the nation, with Black children 4 times more likely than white children to require emergency care for asthma-related complications. These health challenges are compounded by inadequate healthcare access and environmental hazards in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Educational disparities and incarceration further exacerbate these challenges. Black students in Michigan are 3 times more likely than white students to face suspensions or expulsions, often for minor infractions. Coupled with underfunded schools, this creates a school-to-prison pipeline that limits educational outcomes and increases vulnerability to incarceration. Black residents are imprisoned at rates nearly 5 times higher than white residents, perpetuating cycles of poverty and destabilizing families. These systemic challenges have deep historical roots. During the Great Migration, Black families moved to Michigan seeking industrial jobs, but were confined to segregated neighborhoods through redlining and housing discrimination. When industrial jobs declined, these neighborhoods were left without economic support, further deepening the systemic inequalities that persist today. Number 7. Nebraska. Nebraska's image as a peaceful Midwestern state contrasts sharply with the harsh realities faced by its Black residents. In cities like Omaha, systemic neglect and disinvestment have created significant economic and social disparities. In North Omaha, a predominantly Black neighborhood, over 40% of residents live below the poverty line. Access to essential services like healthcare, grocery stores, and public transportation is limited. Many residents rely on an inadequate transit system to reach jobs across the city. These living conditions not only impact health outcomes, but also limit opportunities for economic mobility. Employment challenges further compound these issues. Black Nebraskans face an unemployment rate of 9%, more than double that of white residents. Even among those employed, many work in low-wage industries, earning less than $25,000 annually. Discrimination in hiring practices and limited access to job training programs restrict Black residents' ability to secure stable, high-paying jobs. Furthermore, education remains a significant barrier. Public schools in Omaha are deeply segregated, with predominantly Black schools receiving $1,000 less per student in funding than white schools. This lack of investment results in overcrowded classrooms, outdated materials, and fewer extracurricular opportunities, hindering academic achievement and limiting future opportunities for Black students. It turns out that Nebraska's history is consistent with what is happening with Black people today. The 1919 Omaha riot, which included the lynching of a Black man, Will Brown, exemplifies the hostility Black residents faced. Combined with exclusionary housing policies, these events entrenched systemic barriers that continue to disadvantage Black communities today. Number 6. Missouri. Missouri's overwhelming racial divide is perhaps most evident in St. Louis, where the Del Mar Divide draws a literal and figurative line through the city. North of Del Mar Boulevard, predominantly Black neighborhoods see median home values plummet to less than $50,000, while just a few blocks south, in predominantly white areas, homes are valued at over $300,000. Black families in these northern neighborhoods face persistent challenges accessing affordable loans, and when they do, they often endure higher interest rates, making homeownership an unattainable dream for many. This disparity is not just about property. It reflects a broader systemic inequity that limits generational wealth building for Black Missourians. Healthcare for Black residents further shows the inequities in Missouri. Infant mortality rates for Black Missourians are nearly 3 times higher than those for white residents, a grim indicator of unequal access to quality healthcare. Chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension are also far more prevalent in Black communities, exacerbated by limited healthcare facilities in predominantly Black neighborhoods. These areas often lack medical resources, forcing residents to travel long distances for even basic care, perpetuating a cycle of poor health outcomes. The justice system compounds these disparities. Black residents remain disproportionately targeted by police across the state, with 85% of traffic stops in Ferguson involving Black drivers, despite Black residents making up only 67% of the population. This racial bias extends statewide, where Black Missourians are incarcerated at rates nearly 6 times higher than their white counterparts. These practices destabilize Black families, stripping individuals of opportunities and creating generational cycles of poverty and instability. The roots of these disparities can be traced to Missouri's history as a slave state, which laid the groundwork for systemic racial inequality. Even after emancipation, segregationist policies like restrictive housing covenants and the prevalence of sundown towns continued to exclude Black residents from economic and social opportunities. These historical injustices have left a lasting legacy, manifesting in the entrenched barriers Black Missourians face today. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Number 5. Connecticut. Connecticut is known for its rich suburbs and prestigious universities, yet the state also harbors significant racial disparities that disproportionately affect its Black residents, who make up about 10% of its 3.6 million population. While some communities thrive with opulent homes and elite educational opportunities, others, primarily in urban areas, struggle with systemic inequities in income, housing, and employment. Economic inequality is massive. Black households in Connecticut earn a median income of approximately $47,000, compared to $82,000 for white households, reflecting a $35,000 gap that shows systemic barriers to professional advancement. Many Black workers are confined to low-wage industries like retail and hospitality, with limited opportunities for upward mobility. These financial constraints contribute to a poverty rate of 20% for Black residents, more than 3 times the 6% poverty rate for white residents, creating barriers not just to financial stability, but also to education and healthcare access. Furthermore, housing disparities exacerbate these challenges. Home ownership rates for Black residents stand at only 31%, compared to 75% for white residents. Discriminatory lending practices, inflated property taxes, and limited access to affordable housing confine many Black families to renting in urban areas like Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven. In these neighborhoods, residents often spend over 40% of their income on housing while grappling with deteriorating infrastructure, minimal public investment, and declining property values. These conditions hinder efforts to build generational wealth and reinforce cycles of economic hardship. The unemployment rate for Black residents in Connecticut is 10%, nearly double the 5.5% rate for white residents. Even for those employed, representation in lucrative industries such as finance, insurance, and healthcare remains alarmingly low. Black professionals occupy less than 4% of executive or managerial roles in a state where these sectors dominate, further rooting racial and economic divides. The effects of these disparities ripple into education. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods are some of the most underfunded in the nation. Urban schools receive far less funding than those in affluent suburbs like Greenwich, resulting in higher dropout rates, fewer advanced placement programs, and limited extracurricular opportunities for Black students. Consequently, only 30% of Black adults in Connecticut hold a bachelor's degree, compared to 50% of white adults. This gap in educational attainment perpetuates economic inequality, restricting access to higher-paying careers. Healthcare inequities are equally troubling. Predominantly, Black neighborhoods like North Hartford have life expectancies 8 to 10 years shorter than wealthier, predominantly white suburbs. Chronic illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, and asthma disproportionately affect Black residents, exacerbated by poor air quality and proximity to industrial sites. Limited access to affordable healthcare compounds these issues, creating significant health disparities that impact quality of life. Number 4. South Dakota. South Dakota, with its small Black population comprising about 2% of the state's nearly 900,000 residents, presents significant challenges for its Black community. Despite the state's economic reliance on agriculture and manufacturing, systemic barriers and disparities hinder opportunities for Black residents, creating an environment where upward mobility remains difficult. Economic inequalities are more than visible in South Dakota, where Black households earn a median income of just $30,000, compared to $63,000 for white households. This income gap leaves nearly 30% of Black residents living below the poverty line, far exceeding the 10% poverty rate for white residents. Job opportunities for Black workers are often limited to low-wage industries such as retail and food services, which lack the stability and benefits necessary to break the cycle of poverty. Higher-paying industries, which dominate the state's economy, remain largely inaccessible to Black residents, further entrenching economic disparities. Housing represents another significant area of inequity, with only 25% of Black residents in South Dakota owning homes, compared to 70% of white residents. Discriminatory lending practices and the scarcity of affordable housing options in urban areas like Sioux Falls confine many Black families to renting. Even those who achieve home ownership often do so in neighborhoods with lower property values, minimal resources, and limited access to quality schools, perpetuating economic hardship. The public education system in South Dakota mirrors these disparities. Predominantly, Black schools receive 15 to 20% less funding per student, leading to larger class sizes, outdated materials, and fewer extracurricular opportunities. These inequities contribute to lower graduation rates among Black students and limited access to higher education, creating additional barriers to long-term economic advancement. Compounding these challenges is an unemployment rate for Black residents of approximately 12%, more than double that of white residents, reflecting ongoing discrimination in hiring and career development opportunities. Health outcomes for Black South Dakotans are equally troubling. Chronic illnesses such as diabetes and hypertension are prevalent, exacerbated by limited access to quality health care. These conditions, coupled with high incarceration rates, further destabilize Black families. Black residents are imprisoned at rates more than 5 times higher than white residents, highlighting systemic racial bias in the state's criminal justice system. Number 3. Minnesota. In Minnesota, the Black population makes up only 7% of the state's 5.7 million residents. Yet despite this, Black Minnesotans confront some of the widest racial disparities in the nation. Economic disparities are glaring in Minnesota, where the median household income for Black families is $38,000, compared to $76,000 for white households. This $38,000 gap severely limits opportunities for wealth building and financial security, leaving nearly 28% of Black Minnesotans below the poverty line, compared to just 8% of white residents. The income divide reflects systemic barriers to accessing high-paying jobs, with Black workers often relegated to lower-wage industries that offer limited potential for upward mobility. Housing inequities in Minnesota are among the most pronounced in the country, with only 25% of Black residents owning homes compared to 75% of white residents. Historical practices like redlining in cities such as Minneapolis and St. Paul excluded Black families from stable, high-value neighborhoods. Today, discriminatory lending practices and zoning laws continue to confine Black families to under-resourced areas with declining property values, insufficient public services, and poor infrastructure, further widening the racial wealth gap. Educational disparities add another layer of inequity. Black students in Minnesota face some of the largest achievement gaps in the nation, with graduation rates 30% lower than those of their white counterparts. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods suffer from chronic underfunding, offering fewer advanced placement courses, extracurricular activities, and college preparatory resources. These limitations significantly restrict Black students' access to higher education and the opportunities that come with it. Employment outcomes reflect similar challenges. Black residents experience unemployment rates consistently 2 to 3 times higher than those of white residents. Systemic barriers in hiring practices and underrepresentation in high-paying industries such as healthcare, technology, and finance exacerbate these disparities, leaving Black workers with fewer pathways to economic stability. You should know that Minnesota's deeply rooted inequities stem from a history of exclusionary practices. Racially restrictive covenants once barred Black families from owning property in desirable areas, reinforcing segregation and limiting economic opportunities. The state's systemic racism was brought into sharp focus in 2020 with the killing of George Floyd, an event that sparked global protests and brought attention to the ongoing struggles Black Minnesotans face. While these events have ignited critical conversations about racial justice, the disparities remain entrenched, reflecting the urgent need for systemic change. Number 2. Iowa. Iowa is often celebrated for its rural charm and tight-knit communities, but this conceals a much harsher reality for its Black residents. Comprising just 4% of the state's 3.2 million population, Black Iowans face deep-rooted disparities. For Black families in Iowa, homeownership, a cornerstone of financial stability, remains largely unattainable. While 74% of white residents own homes, only 23% of Black residents can claim the same. This 51-point disparity is among the worst in the nation, driven by discriminatory lending practices, lower incomes, and limited access to affordable housing. Even when mortgages are approved, they often tie Black families to undervalued neighborhoods with fewer community resources. In cities like Waterloo, where the Black population is highest, the homeownership rate drops even further, to a staggering 18%, leaving many Black families renting in areas with crumbling infrastructure and inadequate access to quality schools and healthcare. Economic disparities between Black and white residents in Iowa further illustrate the challenges faced by Black communities. Black households earn a median income of just $31,000, nearly half the $60,000 median income for white households. This $29,000 income gap limits access to better housing, higher education, and health care, reinforcing a cycle of economic disadvantage. Unemployment among Black Iowans is more than twice as high as among their white counterparts, with many Black workers relegated to low-wage jobs in industries with little room for advancement. These economic barriers not only impact individuals, but also ripple across generations, perpetuating poverty and limiting opportunities for upward mobility. Education, often viewed as a gateway to opportunity, remains rampant with inequality for Black students in Iowa. High school graduation rates for Black students lag 15 percentage points behind their white peers, limiting access to higher education and career opportunities. Only 30% of Black adults in Iowa hold a bachelor's degree compared to 50% of white adults, creating a bottleneck for entering high-paying industries. Perhaps the most troubling disparity lies in Iowa's incarceration rates. Black residents are imprisoned at rates 7 times higher than white residents, one of the most disproportionate incarceration gaps in the country. Systemic bias in law enforcement and the judiciary results in Black Iowans being more likely to be arrested, charged, and convicted for similar offenses compared to their white counterparts. These high incarceration rates disrupt family structures, create long-term barriers to employment and housing, and perpetuate cycles of poverty and instability, further entrenching systemic inequality. Number 1. Wisconsin. Wisconsin, often celebrated for its scenic lakes and Midwestern charm, harbors a troubling reality that challenges its idyllic image. Beneath the surface lies a deeply entrenched system of racial disparities, making it one of the most difficult states for Black Americans. In this respect, the economic divide in Wisconsin is overwhelming, with Black households earning a median income of just $32,000, nearly half the $63,000 earned by their white counterparts. This $31,000 disparity forces many Black families to struggle to meet basic needs and prevents them from building long-term financial security. With 34% of Black residents living below the poverty line, over 4 times the 8% poverty rate for white residents, the economic obstacles faced by Black Wisconsinites are both severe and persistent, trapping many in a cycle of financial instability. Home ownership remains largely out of reach for most Black residents in Wisconsin. Only 25% of Black Wisconsinites own homes, compared to 72% of white residents, reflecting a staggering 47-point gap. Education is yet another challenge, with the high school graduation rate for Black students at just 70% compared to 93% for white students, leaving many Black youth at a disadvantage in pursuing higher education or competitive careers. Only 18% of Black adults in the state hold a bachelor's degree, compared to 38% of white adults, further widening the economic divide. The healthcare disparity is visible in Black residents' life expectancy up to 12 years shorter than white residents, and the infant mortality rate for Black babies is 14.5 per 1,000 live births, nearly 3 times higher than for white babies. Perhaps the most glaring inequity lies in Wisconsin's incarceration rates, where Black residents are imprisoned at rates 12 times higher than white residents. In Milwaukee, over 40% of Black men aged 20 to 40 have spent time in prison. Isn't it true that the states where Black people face the most challenges are the ones most resistant to ending slavery? What do you think? Do these states have racism in their very cores that ensure Black people always remain behind and marginalized? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on how Black people should ensure their prosperity in these states. Should they migrate or ask for equal opportunities and rights? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.